When I say that I love the bus or the subway around my friends, they think I'm joking. I'm not. I live in northern New Jersey, meaning that technically I am just one bus ride away from the streets of New York City. Yet, I only take the bus to the city every few months, unlike many in New Jersey who need to take it to get to their workplace 5 unrelenting days a week. For them, it is a very different experience.
My name is Val. I just dislike it. They haven't really done a great job with keeping the trains on time. It could be much better.
Residents in the city limits of Chicago on the south side in a neighborhood called Roseland need more time to get to downtown Chicago within the limits of their own city if they don't have a car than people who live 90 miles away in a community called Roseland, Indiana. We know that we have work to do and we've got to do something to fix that.
So, why does public transport near New York City, along with the rest of the United States, for lack of a better term, suck? And how can we fix it to keep up with the rest of the world? In the 1920s, US public transit was in decent shape. Streetcars and trams were frequent and reliable. Yet, with the rise of cars came the fall of trams. Later in the 1950s, the suburban landscape was popularized.
Arguably, mass transit is what kind of creates the initial suburbanization. What happens, though, in the 19-teens and 20s and 30s is you have the arrival of the automobile. Suburbanites themselves shift to the automobile. New suburbanites moving out no longer are reliant on the streetcar lines. And city governments begin shifting their money. They put their money into new roadways. By the 1960s, most of the transit companies were effectively broke. The systems hadn't become very reliable, and most of the country had shifted to the automobile.
Now, public transport in the US is infamous for its unreliability. Americans had to wait 17 minutes on average to get on public transport in 2022, while 45% of Americans had no access to public transportation at all. Many people also just don't take public transport because they commute from suburb to suburb. Most transit systems use a focal point in the center of whatever city it serves, then fans out from there, which doesn't serve the majority of commuters very well. Plus, public transit still isn't profitable. In 2022, only 23% of the MTA's revenue came from rider fares, while 40% came from taxes and subsidies from local governments.
Now, there's a hidden tax being paid by every American family. It is costing each family $3,300 a year because of the state of play in our infrastructures.
But buses and trains are still an incredible form of transport. Public transit creates lower emissions compared to cars, emitting less than half the CO2 per mile as cars, and it's estimated that public transportation in the US saves 37 million metric tons of carbon dioxide annually. It has better safety, with 23 times a lower mortality rate for buses versus cars, and it also boosts the economy. Every $1 invested in public transport generates $5 in GDP growth and creates jobs. Plus, reduced traffic congestion can result in an additional $800 million annually, and business productivity can jump $1.4 billion every year. Most important, however, are its implications for equity. People of color and low-income communities tend to be near auto-centric traffic, and therefore traffic-related pollution. By increasing reliance on public transit and decreasing reliance on cars, we can lessen the burden of these environmental impacts for marginalized communities. It can also promote health equity, as public transport makes it easier for individuals without cars to access medical care, healthier food options, and vital services to communities that might not otherwise have access to these services. Lastly, public transit promotes economic equity by expanding job access, especially benefiting marginalized communities. This includes Black and Latino populations who have lower car ownership rates and low-income households where only 61% own vehicles compared to 90% of high-income households. And while investing in roads and highways might seem like the obvious choice because 85% of all Americans rely on cars as their main mode of transportation, doubling down on car infrastructure ignores the mounting challenges that we face. The average American family now spends over $500 monthly on car payments alone, not counting gas, insurance, and repairs. Our roads are increasingly congested, contributing to both time waste and environmental damage. Meanwhile, the 15% of Americans who can't afford cars or are unable to drive are disproportionately low-income individuals, elderly, and disabled people, and they're left with few reliable alternatives. So, if public transport is such a great alternative to driving, how can a president make public transit more appealing to US citizens? Well, one way is just by funding it more.
What would really turn things around would be in operating funds for public transit, like we had during the COVID crisis. That kind of funding allowed for transit companies to sustain the service they had and even sometimes improve it.
From a policy perspective, my hope is that one day public transit is treated as an essential public service. And of course, the other sort of goals that come underneath that are we want to make sure we're always cognizant of sustainability, continuing to make sure the system remains, and of course, technology, innovation, continuing again to leverage the latest technology to help improve the customer experience and to help improve the way we do business.
So So after leveling the playing field on a funding level, what can policymakers do to level the playing field within transportation itself? One thing they can do is dedicate more street space to public transit usage. In some cities, streets can make up to 30% of land. A reallocation of these for public transport means dedicated bus lanes, for example, helping ensure high frequencies of service and reliability. South Korea's capital, Seoul and Cheonggyechon, had a highway to linear park conversion initiative. Within months, rider satisfaction shot up to 90%, and speeds in some bus corridors had improved up to 100%. We can also develop housing around public transport networks. From Singapore to Copenhagen, transit-oriented development has helped many cities reduce their carbon footprint while becoming more productive and more livable.
Assuring states that the federal government will continue to be a reliable partner in funding and delivering a safe and efficient national surface transportation network should be a top priority.
How we get around fundamentally shapes the fabric of our communities and the trajectory of our lives. With a president that puts more funding into public transit and implements more transit-oriented infrastructure, we're not just building better buses and trains. We're building a more equitable, sustainable, and connected future for all Americans.
Cool.